Well, welcome everyone. This is Pete Poorman. I'm a director in corporate relations in the Eric Johnson School of Engineering and Computer Science at UT Dallas. It has been my pleasure to partner with the Office of Research here at UTD to bring you today's program, Beyond the NIH, Other Federal Medical R&D. What we want to present to you today is opportunities for research funding and for active participation in healthcare. Other than what many think is the go-to place, which is the National Institutes of Health. And before we begin that program, let me briefly turn the floor over to Steve Gingrich. Steve is a senior advisor in the Office of Research and heads up innovation programs and similar activities. Steve.
Hey, thank you, Pete. Really appreciate it, and great to have everyone here today. So thank you for joining us. Greetings from Dr. Joe Pancrazio, the VP of Office of Research here at UT Dallas. Excited to be able to represent this topic to you today. A couple things I'd like to sort of note for you. First is that the Office of Research has been focusing on an overall emphasis on topics related to engaging with our defense infrastructure in the Department of Defense and a variety of different agencies. And so it may or may not surprise many of you to know who are listening that that the defense sector is the third largest area of grants that we receive grants from at UT Dallas, beyond the NIH and the NSF. So it's a significant source of research funding for us, and it's an area that we want to continue to serve well and grow. I wanted to highlight a couple of things for you to be aware of in terms of resources as you look out to not only to determine what the funding sources are for you at the Office of Research, but also other resources that you have available to you in the way of learning more about how to translate your inventions and other IP ideas into products and services and ultimately, potentially, ventures of some kind. And we have a quite robust set of offerings at UT Dallas to assist you in that process. You can find them both through the Office of Research website, which I've shown a quick clip of, just screen capture of here. And you can get to that website at research.utdallas.edu. And the URL right below that in the slide that you see is a direct URL to our innovation website, which is one that focuses more on equipping and empowering founders of companies, including faculty researchers, PhD candidates, postdocs, into how they can translate their ideas into successful ventures. And then the third one is just for those that have interest in the other resources that UT Dallas has that are significant for our military students and personnel, is the utdallas.edu sub-website, the veterans pages. I encourage you to take a look at that and see what services we already have available at UT Dallas. I want to thank a couple of people real quick here. Of course, Pete has been a terrific partner with me as leading the effort to create opportunities for you to learn more about DoD engagement through the Office of Research. Also, Emily Lacey, many of you from UT Dallas know Emily. Emily is a terrific resource for sponsored research projects and leads that area. And then a thank you to Suzanne Head and Enrica Ziller, who are helping to run today's program. I want to turn it over to our speaker today, who will do the rest of the presenting. Dean Calcagni is going to take you through a great program on health-related and medical-related programs and funding beyond the NIH. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dean. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve, very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you, what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about my background and some of the relevant facts, You're probably wondering, who is this guy that's talking to us today? I had been an active duty physician and anesthesiologist on active duty for 26 years in the Army. I spent my last 18 years at Fort Detrick at the Army Medical Research and Development Command, where I managed some of the medical R&D programs that we'll be talking about today. After I retired from active duty, I spent some time in industry, and I also spent some time at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, which is a university-affiliated research center, gets its designation from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Let's move on, please. Next slide. All right. During the Depression, there was a guy by the name of Willie Sutton who robbed banks. And like most bank robbers, he was eventually caught. And after he was caught, a reporter asked him, "Willie, why do you rob banks?" And the answer that Willie supposedly gave him is, "That's where the money is." So along that same line, that's why we're going to be talking about the Army Medical Research and Development Command. So outside of the Department of Health and Human Services, which encompasses NIH and a few other related organizations, more than 90% of the federal medical research dollars go to this organization, Medical Research and Development Command. So that's why we're going to be talking about it. Next slide, please. As you do your own research learning about MRDC, you may find that it had a different name before 2019. It was the Army Medical Research and Materiel Command. So either name that you find, it's the same organization. So don't be confused about the name change. Next slide, please. Let's talk about some of the long-standing MRDC research programs. And what I've done in some of these slides, you'll see at the bottom where I've got the Google logo there, rather than give you a long URL that you may or may not be able to transcribe perfectly. If you just Google on USA MRDC, you're going to come to a link that's going to give you a lot of information about their research programs. Next slide, please. And I'm going to discuss these research programs in the order that I think they are relevant to the faculty in the School of Engineering at UT Dallas. Starting out with a group that's near and dear to my heart, Combat Casualty Care Research Program. This was a program of which I was a director for many years, and I would describe it as being involved as trying to empower the combat medic so that they can keep the injured soldiers alive and reduce their complications before they're able to be evacuated to the field hospitals. You can see I've underlined traumatic brain injury. This is an area that I think particularly overlaps with some of you at UTD, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. Next slide, please. Clinical and Rehab Medicine Research Program. This is a relatively new program talking about after the soldier has been evacuated from the battlefield, after the initial life-saving surgery has been conducted, the long process of rehabbing that soldier and either getting them back to active duty or allowing them to transition to a productive life as a civilian. We have more than a few soldiers who are on active duty with prosthetic limbs. So even though you lose a limb, doesn't mean you necessarily have to leave the service. And as you know, we have some highly, highly motivated soldiers that just, regardless of their injuries, can't wait to recover from them and get back to active duty. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Operational Medicine Research Program. Well, you know from the popular media, movies and whatnot, how dangerous it is on the battlefield. But being deployed is more than just having the bad guys trying to kill you. A lot of a deployment is just being in an austere environment. Extreme heat, extreme cold, psychological stresses of being in a remote environment. And this is what the operational medicine research program looks at. Developing things so that our soldiers can be more fit and can function in these austere environments. Next slide, please. Medical Simulation and Information Sciences Research Program, again, near and dear to my heart. Another organization that I was a part of at MRDC was a place called Telemedicine and Advanced Technology Research Center. This was an organization that did a lot of demonstration projects in this area. This slide refers to the headquarters element that reports to the commanding general in this area and provides a lot of the extramural funding, some of which might go to UT Dallas. And it covers the entire spectrum of computer science and information technology, medical simulation, robotics, interoperability, and if we, I know the Department of Computer Science and Electrical Engineering at UTD, if you have some ideas and some things that you're working on that might help improve medicine or the delivery of healthcare, we can talk about that. Next slide, please. The Infectious Disease Research Program. Here we're talking about naturally occurring infectious diseases. For many years, the Army has been conducting research in malaria, which and actually other tropical diseases, which continue to pose a hazard for soldiers deployed to those tropical environments. Going back, I guess almost 30 years now, the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, which is part of MRDC, was conducting some of the world's leading research in HIV and in AIDS. And in fact, Bob Redfield, who's now the director of the CDC, is a former Army physician. He was the one that 30 years ago was heading up this HIV research effort. And another individual that you may have seen on those daily briefings from the White House, Deborah Birx, she's also a former Army physician. She was working for Bob Redfield doing some of that HIV research. Next slide, please. Chem and biodefense. Here we're talking about medical countermeasures against chemical agents and biological agents that the bad guys might develop and use against our service members. Looking at the research interests of the faculty in the Department of Engineering, I saw one individual is doing some work looking at chemical agent byproducts. So that would be a logical fit for this program. Next slide, please. All right. We finished with the established long-term programs, and we're going to talk about an organization now, congressionally directed medical research program, CDMRP. And again, if you Google on the phrase CDMRP annual report, you'll come to a page that has all their annual reports from past years, and you can download the 2019 annual report, and you'll learn more than I know about CDMRP if you study it. Next slide, please. CDMRP was started a while ago when Hillary Clinton was the first lady. She was very active working with the breast cancer patient advocacy community. They wanted to have the federal government put some funds into the NIH budget to do some directed research to improve the treatment of breast cancer. Unfortunately, that's not the way the NIH works. They do more basic research, the research they do in cancer may help breast cancer, it may help other forms of cancer, but it's not focused on a specific form of cancer. So Hillary Clinton went on and worked with Congress, and Congress ended up putting in a congressional earmark for breast cancer research. They put that earmark into the DoD budget, and this is how CDMRP got started. That money ended up at Fort Detrick at the Army Medical Research and Development Command. Since then, in the past almost 30 years, other patient advocacy groups have broken the code and have gotten with their congressional representatives and have been successful in adding a congressional earmark for their disease of interest. The latest budget for CDMRP is over $1 billion, and CDMRP is part of MRDC. Next slide, please. Okay, you can see I've underlined breast cancer, and I know that one of the engineering faculty at UTD is doing some work related to breast cancer, so that would be an obvious source of potential funding. You may be wondering, what does multiple sclerosis have to do with the DoD? What does neurofibromatosis have to do with the DoD? Again, this is a congressional earmark, and Congress has put it in the DoD budget. CDMRP has been very effective at executing these funds that have been sent their way, and they've continued to grow. Next slide, please. On this slide, you'll see some programs that are very relevant to DoD, and there have been some congressional earmarks and some budget plus-ups and some other sources of funds, other color of money other than strictly coming through the Department of the Army that end up at MRDC, and CDMRP has helped execute those funds. I don't want to get into a detailed discussion of the different colors of money because that's not relevant to you, but that's why you'll see this list of topics that parallel very closely the earlier list of topics that we talked about. Let's move on to the next slide. Okay, I understand from talking to Pete and Steve that the School of Engineering, a lot of you are involved in developing devices that have medical applications. And this is where the advanced development might come in. And there's an organization that's part of MRDC, USAMDA, Medical Material Development Activity, that does a lot of device development. Now, I will say this, they're not going to spend large amounts of resources into helping you develop your device, but they might give you some funding for a demonstration project. And we'll talk about some of those mechanisms in some later slides that work particularly well with medical devices for you to be able to demonstrate them and get a little funding as well. The main thing that goes on in advanced development in the pharmaceutical systems area is, as I alluded to earlier, the development of vaccines, especially against tropical diseases. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So again, if you Google on the phrase doing business with USA MRDC, you'll be able to download this 10-page document called Gateway to Partnerships, and we're going to be talking about various aspects of it here. Let's move on to the next slide, please. The broad agency announcement. Broad agency announcement is a mechanism that not only MRDC uses, but a lot of federal groups that do R&D have their own broad agency announcements. Just the other day, I was looking at a broad agency announcement from the Food and Drug Administration. So this is the MRDC broad agency announcement. It's a little hard to get a hold of. You've got three options. to get a hold of it, you can contact the Office of Research at UTD. They can send you a PDF copy. You can contact me. I can send you a PDF copy. Or if you want to try to do it yourself, get that 10-page pamphlet on Gateway to Partnerships. You can download that, and then you drill down there, and they show you some somewhat involved instructions to be able to drill down to get your own PDF copy. Next slide, please. So why is this broad agency announcement so important? Well, it's always out there, and you can think of it as an open invitation for you to send your ideas into MRDC on topics that might be relevant for them. And it contains more details on the program descriptions, the process for making awards, all the detailed administrative issues that you need to follow to submit a proposal or an application, the review process, and how they're going to manage it. Next slide, please. There are other program announcements outside of the BAW, and they are available at a place called grants.gov. Grants.gov is not something unique to MRDC. This is something that the federal government uses more than 1,000 different grant programs across the entire federal government. So I know a lot of you that are joining us today are doing other work outside of the biomedical area. So I would encourage you to explore this grants.gov site for some programs that may be non-medical programs, but may be relevant to the work that you're doing. If you want to find other program announcements in the biomedical area, there are some instructions in that Gateway to Partnerships pamphlet that I was referring to. I've got a screenshot here of the medically relevant program announcements. And if you have your glasses on, you can read the fine print. You can see that most of these are from CDMRP. This is where they post all their program announcements. Next slide, please. SBIRs, STTRs, Small Business Innovative Research Program. This is for small businesses, as the name suggests. And so for those of you that have developed an idea or a device to the point where you have started your own small business that has been spun off of UTD, then you would be eligible to apply for an SBIR. There's a related program, STTR, Small Technology Transfer Research Program, where the small business partners with a nonprofit research institution, such as UT Dallas or UT Southwestern, to develop the product. The idea is you have to have something that has the potential for commercialization. So if you're involved in a small business and you want to get a little seed funding to get going, you can see the amounts for phase 1 and for phase 2. And the phase 1 awards are relatively easy to get. The real challenge, the real payoff is if you're able to get a phase 2 award, grants up to $1 million. Next slide, please. This next area, Cooperative Research and Development Agreements, CRADAs. This is a legal document that would be established between UTD and MRDC. It allows the DoD to evaluate a new medical product. And here, I think what we're talking about that would be relevant to you would be a medical device. And the MRDC is not going to give you any funding, but they are going to establish a legal agreement with you where they will take your device or your product and test it and evaluate it and give you some feedback on it and tell you what they like about it, what they don't like about it, some constructive criticism of how you can improve it, and particularly what you need to do to make it more applicable for military usage. That's a CRADA. Next slide, please. So I've talked to Pete and I've talked to Steve and others in the Office of Research and the School of Engineering at UTD, reviewed the website, reviewed the web pages for many of you, and particularly in the Department of Mechanical Engineering, I was more successful in some of the other areas, and it was very easy to drill down and figure out the types of things you were doing, and you can see some of the topics here. We've talked about some of them already, but these are areas that would be of potential interest to MRDC. The Department of Bioengineering, obviously, just about anything you're doing has some potential fit, but I wasn't able to drill down as easily to find specific areas. So we'll talk a little bit about that for the next steps. And then the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, we talked a little bit about medical informatics. Medical informatics, a very broad area. You saw the slide earlier that I showed you. You can think of the different applications using the acronym CARE, C-A-R-E, where C is for clinical, a clinical application of something you may have developed. A is for administrative. Maybe it's a billing system. Maybe it's a resource management system. R is for research. Medical informatics, bioinformatics is at the heart of genomics research, where they're processing, giga and beyond gigabits of information, coding DNA sequencing and genetic sequencing. So that's R. And then E is education, medical simulation, and other things that could be applied for education. A big thing that the Department of Defense does is training, and it trains its combat medics and all of the other related, not only physicians, nurses, but all the other ancillary professions. And so there has been an effort in medical simulation. Back when I was at Tatrick, we funded the development of an anesthesia simulator that incorporated all the underlying physiology and drug effects, how that affected the physiology. There were surgical simulators. So there's potential there for the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering across a broad spectrum. Next slide, please. And then there's other schools at UTD, there's research centers, there's institutes. We mentioned UT Southwestern. I realize that's not part of UTD, but it's located in the same geographical area. And I'm sure some of you are partnering with some of the staff there. That's an obvious area. The Texas Biomedical Device Center, we talked a little bit about traumatic brain injury rehabilitation earlier. This one is particularly relevant. And I'm sure that in my brief review of what's going on there, it seems like there's a lot of areas of potential interest and some other schools and some other centers. Next slide, please. Okay, well, we're getting at the end here of my presentation today. So what are the next steps? All this is fine, but what do I do if I'm interested? Well, you're going to hear in a couple of minutes, Steve and Pete are going to tell you about a survey that you're going to be getting, that the Office of Research is going to be sending out, and it's to gauge your level and the extent of your interest in following up with us and following up with MRDC. I've put some contact information for myself, but I think the idea is I'm available to answer some initial questions that you might have. You can email me, you can call me, but you need to coordinate what you're doing with the Office of Research, and we can't get too deep into this process unless you've coordinated it with the Office of Research. That second to last bullet is something that I'd like to talk about, pre-proposals, pre-applications. when I was managing medical R&D programs, we use this mechanism, and MRDC continues to use it, and it saves everybody on both sides time and money. So you basically put together a one-page concept of what you'd like to do with a rough estimate of what your budget would be, and you send it into one of these offices, and they take a look at it, and they say, yeah, we're interested. Please send us a full proposal. Or they say, thank you, but this doesn't fit our program, and it saves everybody time and money from putting together a full proposal when it's not a good fit. And so again, myself and the Office of Research can assist you if you'd like to submit a pre-proposal. Next slide, please. So to summarize, we talked about MRDC, we talked about the research programs, we talked about CDMRP, all the congressional earmarks, some of the ins and outs of doing business, the BAW, other program announcements, SBIRs, the CRADAs. We talked about some of the initial next steps that you can do. And let's go to the next slide. Okay. So Steve and Pete, if we have time, I'd be glad to take some questions, but I will leave it up to you folks to organize that process.
Sure, thanks, Dean. At this time, we don't have any questions in the chat box, but I welcome all of the attendees to go ahead and type something out. Steve or Pete, was there anything that you wanted to clarify or questions that came to you?
One thing I'd offer is, and just to emphasize again, we have a unique opportunity in Texas with the creation of the and location of the Army Futures Command in Austin within the past 2 years, and it's been scaling up. And you know, that's part of our interest. Both the AFC, the Army Futures Command, has a strategic relationship with the 2 state university systems, our UT system and also the Texas A&M system, to work diligently to engage university researchers and faculty in kind of the problems that they're working through. And so so it's just another opportunity and a reason why we're kind of re-emphasizing our focus on this whole area of opportunity for research projects. So anyhow, I see, looks like there's a comment about eligibility. Do you want to maybe clarify that in the chat box?
Well, I'm skimming through the chat box here.
So the question is, are non-U.S. citizens eligible to apply for these funding?
The answer to that is yes. MRDC not only funds you know, faculty at U.S. universities that might not have U.S. citizenship, they also provide some funding to individuals overseas in other countries. And so in general, the answer is yes.
Great. There's another question I've received. Can you speak to any potential opportunities that you might see someone in our business school being able to take advantage of, maybe process management?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's not so much MRDC, but we could certainly talk to some of the folks at a group called the Defense Health Agency. And I intentionally did not show you a big organizational chart of all the different organizations in the Army and in the Department of Defense, but the Defense Health Agency is relatively new, and all of the Army, Navy, Air Force medical treatment facilities are now coming under this Defense Health Agency, whereas in the past, they came under the individual surgeon generals for each of the three services. So the Defense Health Agency is involved in managing healthcare delivery, and not only are they involved in managing it for our military facilities, but there's a very large program called TRICARE, which is a civilian healthcare program for DoD beneficiaries to get their healthcare in the civilian sector, and that's very large as well. I can tell you that the DoD budget is approaching, the DoD budget for healthcare for its active duty members, retirees, and beneficiaries is in the neighborhood of 15% of the entire DoD budget. And one of the quotes from the former Secretary of Defense, Gates, said, "Healthcare is eating my lunch." So the whole issue from looking at healthcare, you know, from the business perspective is very important, and new ideas are always welcome. And before I answer any other questions, I just want to say that I want to thank Dr. Pancrazio for his willingness for us to go through this today, and willingness to allow this as an opportunity for the folks in the School of Engineering, and for his vision in thinking outside the box.
It's very kind of you.
Question.
We do have another one for MRDC, excuse me, BAAs. Are there possibilities for small business and university collaborations?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the best mechanism for that is not through the broad agency announcement, but rather through the SBIR process. And you know, the Office of Research can help anyone who's interested in applying. We've spoken as part of the planning before we did this webinar, and so the folks in the Office of Research are familiar with the mechanisms that you would use to apply for an SBIR program. But the SBIR program, the STTR program, they're designed for those types of partnerships, and every one of those programs that I described to you, the way it's federal law that any federal organization conducting R&D has to devote a certain percentage of their R&D budget to the SBIR program. And so MRDC is no exception. And so every one of those programs that we talked about has an SBIR program. Any other questions?
We do have.
Not hearing it. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We do have some coming in. Regarding stem cell research, if it's not listed yet, how can it be added to the list?
Could you repeat your question?
Sure. Regarding stem cell research, if it's not listed, how can it be added to the list?
Stem cell research, if folks look at the slide, the Office of Rehab Medicine, you know, I had a picture of a guy with a prosthesis, but they're doing a lot of other things that may involve stem cells. They have an entire regenerative medicine and transplant medicine program, and both for and they've had a long-standing one for burn injury and skin regeneration, but they're doing a lot of really exciting cutting-edge work that would also include stem cells. So if someone has an idea, this clinical and rehab medicine research program might be a source of research support. Any other questions?
Yes. Would you recommend writing a pre-application and/or white paper for something, even if there's not a program announcement for that topic?
Well, okay. The broad agency announcement is very, very broad, and I would encourage anyone who's considering doing what you just described to take a look at the broad agency announcement and see if what the work that they're doing looks like it would fit under that. And if you can't come up with a way that you think it would fit under one of those programs, then you probably shouldn't do it. Or if you still want to pursue it, you can talk to me, and I can give you that would be the first go around that we would have for an interaction is, describe your concept to me, and I can tell you whether I think it would fit anywhere. But the broad agency announcement, I didn't try to describe a detailed laundry list of all the different topics there. That's why they call it the broad agency announcement. It covers a lot of things. Next question.
Yes. Could you describe what kind of research would be the best subject for BAA, and maybe how to decide between SBIR or BAA or any other form?
Oh, okay. Well, the SBIR is more limited, okay? If you have a product, if you are, have spun off a business venture to develop your product, or if you're interested in doing that, and you have something that has the potential for commercialization to become a product, then the SBIR program is perfect. If you're working at a more early level, a more basic research level, and you don't have a product, then you'd want to go through the BAA process. Any other questions?
Yes. And then what is your recommendation for first contact with these organizations?
Again, and this is why the Office of Research has allowed me to put my contact information on the slide, again, with the proviso that, for everyone at UTD to keep the Office of Research up to speed on what you're doing, you can contact me, either by phone or by email, and we can have an early discussion to try to gauge how good a fit, the ideas are with the programs at MRDC. It's all a question of fit. It's not a question that, your work isn't good enough. It's the question, does your work fit the broad areas that they're doing research in? Next question.
I think that might catch us up. I believe, though, Steve G., you had some comments to share?
Well, I mean, there's one thing I've noticed in some of the chat conversations. There's some questions from folks from other schools and other systems, including Texas A&M, about uh, research areas that they have and interest areas that they have. There's another contact like us at the other UT system schools and the other Texas A&M schools. And generally speaking, I've got access to those and would be happy to, for anybody that is from one of those institutions that wants to speak with the innovation and commercialization leads in those other schools, to let us know or let you know, Enrica, after the fact, and we can connect them with the right people. I know if you're part of the Texas A&M system, you know, you would probably be best served to engage through the Bush Combat Development Complex, the BCDC, which is Texas A&M's sort of flagship announced organization that is the key link between the Army Futures Command and Texas A&M. There are many others at Texas A&M, but that's a sort of a primary linkage point. And so contacting the folks with BCDC is probably the right place to begin for A&M colleagues.
And Steve, if I can jump in, this is Dean. From my perspective, my consulting group is Medical Red Team, and Medical Red Team is being supported by UT Dallas to work with the UT Dallas folks. And you very graciously invited some folks from outside of UTD to attend, but it wouldn't be right for UT Dallas to provide the support outside for other universities. But I can tell you, I would be glad to talk to Texas A&M or anybody else if they're interested in setting up arrangements for us to work with their people. I did get a text message here asking how do you ask questions, and the answer is for those folks to use the chat option that's on the Cisco WebEx page on my screen. It's in the lower right-hand corner, and you just type in a message, and then Enrica, it has been going through them and reading the questions. So if there's any more questions, that's how you do it. Are there any more questions, Enrica?
Yes. Is CDMRP interested in basic medical research?
To some degree they are. To some degree they are. That's a tough question, you know, because I told you, you know, every disease advocacy community wants to fund research that they can see a direct connection to their, you know, to their disease. So, and, you know, we talked about the breast cancer thing. You can do some, let's use breast cancer as an example. You can do some basic research, but if you're trying to do basic research in breast cancer, then you have to be able to have a compelling scientific argument for why the work you're doing, you know, specifically applies to breast cancer. If it's just a broad research that's investigating cellular mechanisms and cellular regulation and how cells become neoplastic, then you're probably not going to be successful at the CDMRP. Next question.
Yes. And then we've got one more. Is it helpful when applying for these grants to really emphasize the military benefits?
Well, this is where we come in at the Medical Red Team. And back when I was on active duty and was reviewing proposals. By the way, you know, through the broad agency announcement, anybody can submit anything. And sometimes we see some pre-proposals and there was a military justification where people had made assumptions about how the military works, about how military healthcare works, that, you know, were fundamental assumptions, but were not the right assumptions. And so, you know, this is where we come in, is helping you determine if the work you're doing is militarily relevant, and if it is, helping you describe it in terms that, you know, will communicate its relevance. A very wise individual, when I was on active duty, said, when we were generating annual reports and whatnot, he said, "Dean, don't just describe what you're doing, describe the so what." We had researchers that did a great job at focusing on their research area of interest and saying what they were doing, but it was our job then, when I was running the programs, to describe why it was militarily relevant, the so what. So that's my answer. Next question.
Looks like we are all caught up. I did just post a last call for questions in the chat. We've got about less than 10 minutes left in our session today.
Okay, well, while we have a moment or two for some last minute questions, again, I just want to thank, again, Dr. Pancrazio, everyone in the Office of Research, in the School of Engineering, and everyone else who was involved in organizing this webinar. I want to thank all of the attendees, and again, coordinate with the Office of Research, but I look forward to interacting with you on an individual basis and on a more detailed basis, and taking a look at what you're doing and giving you an idea of if and what we should do for the next steps. I know there's a lot of exciting work going on at UTD, and I can't wait to dig into some of it with you. So that's all from me for now. I'll turn it back to you, Anrika, or Steve, or Pete.
Yes, I think we've got time for a couple more, and we have seen a couple more come through. So could you please explain the NPI website and the MTEC?
Okay, the MRDC website, and what was the other one?
NPI.
MPI. I'm not sure. That's not ringing a bell with me. You know, the MRDC website, on some of those slides, I had, you know, told you what to Google on, and MRDC does a great job of describing their programs. And so if you're interested in the MRDC programs, just Google on USA MRDC. And if you're interested in CDMRP, if you Google on CDMRP annual report, you'll come to a page that has all the annual reports, and you can download that. They also have a website, but I really like the annual report. It's organized very nicely and has a page or two on each one of those individual programs. So those were two of the websites. The other important website was that Doing Business with MRDC and the Gateway to Partnerships. That's also on one of the slides. And Anrika, I'm sure that the slide set will be made available to all of today's participants. Am I correct?
We will make the recording available, yes.
How about the slides themselves?
I'll have to get back to you. I don't know.
That will be fine. We can send them out, Dean. That's no problem.
Okay, good. So go through those slides, and you know, so I'm sorry, a little bit confused as to what the exact question is, but those slides, on the key slides where I had the Google logo in the lower right-hand corner, if you just Google on the words that I put there, you'll find all kinds of resources. And if you get stuck, just go to the Office of Research. They've got all these resources as well, and they can help you, or give me a call. I'll be glad to help you.
Dean, thank you very much for your information you provided today, for the willingness to work with us here at UTD and help us engage more deeply with medical opportunities beyond those available through the NIH. It is 5 minutes to the hour, so in respect for all of your time, we're going to go ahead and close this session here. You will be receiving a survey from the Office of Research. Please do look to that for links and information on getting additional, the recording of the webinar and additional information, and of course, engaging through the Office of Research with Dean and his team to go after these opportunities. Thank you all for participating today.
Thank you very much, Pete. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.